In March of 1832, on the eastern edge of Edgefield District, South Carolina, Josiah Carter realized that hope could break as quietly as wood bending too far, and that night he resolved to either escape slavery or die trying. At 29, he was enslaved on Red Hollow Plantation, a cotton operation owned by Edmund Graves, who ruled through fear and isolation, surrounding the land with pine forest, swamp, patrol roads, and dogs trained to maim. Josiah had been sold twice before turning 15, learning that lies, paper, and memory shape survival. In 1834, Clara May arrived from Virginia, able to read maps thanks to her father's work with surveyors, and together they spoke in coded language about weather, birds, and moss, disguising escape plans as survival. By 1837, whispers of the Underground Railroad reached Red Hollow, though many doubted its existence. Their circle grew to include Henry Booth, a 50-year-old with a blind eye and a limp from shackles, who had once failed to escape but knew patrol patterns. In 1839, Graves tightened control with night counts, guards, and more dogs, and Clara overheard that 6 enslaved people, including Josiah, were to be sold south to the sugar fields of Louisiana, a near-certain death sentence. They chose August 3, 1839, under a thin moon and storm cover, preparing without supplies to avoid suspicion. Clara memorized routes north toward Greenville and west to the mountains, while Henry described a river crossing where scent broke apart. That night, thunder shook the cabins as they fled barefoot, walking to avoid mistakes. Dogs were released before dawn, but they stayed together despite Henry's advice to split. At the Saluda River, Clara nearly drowned before Josiah pulled her free under gunfire. Henry then turned back, distracting the dogs with shouts and a limp, smiling once as if choosing his fate. Josiah and Clara pressed on, hiding in barns and forests, starving but clinging to hope until near Asheville, they met a white woman who told them, "Follow the fence line until it disappears," which led them to a Quaker farm. By October, Josiah crossed into Ohio, crying not for safety but for Henry's sacrifice. Clara continued north while Josiah stayed, their freedom dividing them forever. By 1845, Josiah worked under his own name, cautiously, never fully trusting even freedom. In 1851, the Fugitive Slave Act nearly cost him everything, teaching him that freedom could also be hunted, and he survived by remembering how to vanish. When emancipation was declared in 1863, Josiah did not celebrate, instead mourning those who never lived to hear the word. He told his story only once, to a boy who asked how freedom felt, answering, "Freedom feels like walking even when you're terrified," because standing still was worse. In November of 1840, Josiah Carter learned that freedom did not erase fear, it refined it. Living in a small settlement outside Cincinnati, he worked loading crates along the Ohio River, honest and exhausting labor that was temporary by design. He never stayed anywhere long enough to be remembered. Names were dangerous, and familiarity worse. Every knock after dark made his muscles tense, a reflex born from nights when men came to take things. Rumors swirled constantly, slave catchers crossing the river, free men dragged south with forged papers, rewards printed in newspapers with descriptions vague enough to fit any black man with scars. Josiah read those notices not for faces but for patterns, which counties paid more, which names repeated, where laws bent under the weight of money. In 1842, he met Reverend Amos Wright, a black preacher who preached movement instead of escape. "Still water grows foul," Amos would say, and the congregation understood. Amos quietly helped Josiah find safe labor farther north in Sandusky, near Lake Erie, closer to Canada, closer to something like permanence. The journey north was slower than his escape had been, marked by careful steps and borrowed papers from a dead man, altered just enough to pass in poor light. Every town felt like a test designed to make him fail. He answered simply, never argued, and learned that survival often meant appearing smaller than you were. By 1844, Josiah stood on the shore of Lake Erie, watching the cold, gray water stretch endlessly toward Canada. Boats crossed daily, and he felt something close to grief. He had escaped slavery, but not its reach. Crossing again meant starting over once more, and Josiah was tired of running without knowing who he was allowed to become. In January of 1845, winter hardened everything around Lake Erie, freezing the water in places and slicing through clothing with knife-like wind. Josiah Carter remained in Sandusky, working quietly at a cooper's yard repairing barrels, repetitive safe labor that made memories louder in the stillness. At night, he dreamed of Henry standing in the river, water rising around him, smiling as if peace had already found him. Josiah woke drenched in sweat, whispering apologies into the dark. That winter, he learned something unsettling. Many who reached the north did not cross into Canada immediately, not because they couldn't, but because they hesitated. Freedom demanded decisions, and slavery had stolen that muscle. Some stayed too long. Some were caught. The lake became both promise and warning, its shifting ice cracking like bones beneath the surface, pressing on Josiah's chest each time he stood near the shore. In April of 1846, news of a slave-catching ring in Cleveland spread fear through Sandusky. Officials bribed, free black men kidnapped and sold south. Names vanished overnight. Josiah packed his few belongings and moved inland to Oberlin, a town whispered about for its boldness in sheltering runaways. Oberlin changed him. For the first time since his escape, he spoke part of his story aloud, enough to matter. He worked alongside white abolitionists who treated him as a man, not a cause, and there he learned to write his name, fully, carefully, as if carving it into permanence. Each letter was a reclaiming. By 1848, Josiah made his decision. He would cross the lake, not to erase the past, but to anchor the future somewhere beyond the law's reach. On a cold dawn, he boarded a small vessel bound for Fort Malden, Upper Canada. As the shoreline faded, Josiah did not look back. Some things deserved remembrance, but not pursuit. The water carried him forward, steady and indifferent, toward a freedom that would finally let him stand still. In May of 1848, Josiah Carter set foot on Canadian soil near Fort Malden, the air colder and sharper than he expected, and for the first time no one questioned his presence or demanded papers. That silence unsettled him more than pursuit ever had, for every step of his life until then had required explanation. Here silence was permission, and Josiah stood still, letting the reality settle into his bones. This was not escape, it was arrival. He traveled east toward Buxton Settlement, a community built by formerly enslaved people who believed freedom required structure as much as courage, with schools, farms, and churches raised by hands that once harvested cotton under whips. The land was unforgiving, the winters brutal, but the work belonged to those who did it, and for the first time Josiah labored knowing the result would not be taken from him. By 1850, he owned a small, rocky plot of 5 acres, stubborn soil that he worked anyway. Each fence post driven into the earth felt symbolic, a defiance against slavery's lesson that nothing lasted. Farming demanded belief in tomorrow, and though some nights he doubted himself, staring at the stars and wondering if he had earned the right to plan ahead, each morning the soil answered with quiet persistence. That same year, news of the Fugitive Slave Act crossed the border, and Canada filled with new arrivals, exhausted and terrified. Josiah helped them when he could, offering food, directions, or silence when needed, never asking too many questions, because freedom often began with not being interrogated. One night in 1851, a man arrived with a limp and a blind eye. His name was not Henry, but he spoke like him, describing a river crossing in South Carolina, a storm, and dogs losing scent. Josiah listened without interruption, heart pounding, and when the man finished, he understood something essential. Escape stories did not end, they multiplied. Survival was not an individual victory. It was a chain passed hand to hand. By 1853, Buxton had grown louder with children's voices in the mornings, hammers striking wood, and hymns drifting across fields at dusk. Josiah found himself becoming someone others sought out, not a leader by title, but by steadiness, a man who had crossed rivers, borders, and fear itself. New arrivals watched how he moved, unhurried and deliberate, as if calm were something that could be learned by imitation. That same year, he began writing letters for those who could not, messages meant for families still trapped in the South, coded with ordinary words hiding dangerous truths. Corn harvests meant survival, bad weather meant pursuit. Each letter carried hope disguised as banality, and Josiah never signed his full name, for slavery had taught him the cost of being fully known. In 1856, word reached Buxton of violence in Kansas Territory, where slavery and freedom clashed openly, and Josiah realized that distance did not dull history's blade, it sharpened it. Freedom was not a destination, but a condition that required defense, and even in Canada the future felt uncertain. In 1857, Josiah married Eliza Moore, born enslaved in Virginia and escaped through Pennsylvania. Their courtship was quiet, careful, built on shared silences more than words, and on their wedding day Josiah felt something unfamiliar, groundedness, not safety, but purpose. When their first child was born in 1859, Josiah wept openly, not from joy alone, but from grief for a lineage interrupted. This child would never be owned, cataloged, priced, or chased. Holding the small, warm weight against his chest, Josiah understood that escape had finally completed its arc, not because he was free, but because his child would never need to run. In 1861, war reached even the quiet fields of Buxton, not with cannon fire, but with uncertainty, as the American Civil War began, and newspapers carried maps and casualty lists across the border. Josiah read every line slowly, knowing freedom was fighting for its own definition, and the outcome would decide whether escape had been temporary or permanent. Men in Buxton debated returning south to fight, some believing it was their duty, others fearing the loss of everything they had built. Josiah listened more than he spoke, understanding both impulses. Rage demanded action, survival urged caution, and in the end he stayed, believing resistance did not always require a battlefield but sometimes endurance. By 1863, news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Canada, and while bells rang and prayers filled churches, Josiah remained still, knowing words on paper did not resurrect the dead or erase scars. Freedom declared and freedom lived were different creatures, and he rejoiced quietly, holding his son close, whispering promises history had not yet earned. That winter, he taught his son to read by firelight, letters, then names, then dates, insisting the boy understand when he was born and why it mattered. Time, Josiah said, is proof. Slavery had stolen years, but knowledge reclaimed them, and the child listened wide-eyed, absorbing the gravity without fully grasping it. In 1865, the war ended and slavery was abolished, the word echoing everywhere as if chains dissolved instantly at its utterance. Josiah stood at the edge of his land and felt neither triumph nor relief but responsibility. Freedom had survived, and it would need guardians. He was ready to be one. In 1866, the years immediately after the war brought a strange quiet. Freedom had been declared, but peace had not settled evenly. Letters and travelers from across the border spoke of reconstruction, of laws written quickly and enforced unevenly, of hope tangled with violence. Josiah listened carefully, knowing the South was changing, but painfully, and not always forward. Canada still felt like an anchor in rough water. That summer he welcomed visitors from Tennessee and Georgia, newly freed families searching for land and distance from old masters. Some planned to stay only briefly before returning south to claim wages or relatives. Josiah never advised against return, but he never encouraged it either. He understood how memory could pull harder than chains, and how dangerous that pull could be. By 1868, his son was old enough to work the fields beside him, asking questions about accents, scars, and silences that fell over gatherings when certain places were mentioned. Josiah answered honestly but gently. You were born into freedom, but you must learn why. History, he believed, was armor, and without it even free men could be wounded easily. In 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified in the United States granting black men the right to vote, celebration reached Buxton again, cautious but hopeful. Josiah marked the day by planting a new apple tree. Having learned to measure progress not only by laws but by roots, trees required patience, and so did justice. As the decade turned, Josiah felt age settle into his bones. The running years were behind him now, and what remained was testimony. He began telling his story more fully to neighbors, to children, to anyone who asked, not to glorify escape but to explain its cost. Freedom, he taught them, was not found in flight alone, but in what you build once you finally stop running. In 1872, Buxton faced its first true test of unity when a harsh winter ruined crops and froze supply routes, hunger creeping quietly into homes that had known only modest comfort. Josiah organized shared labor and pooled food stores, insisting no family endure the cold alone, for slavery had taught him the danger of isolation and he believed survival was always collective. That winter Josiah fell ill, fever keeping him bedridden as he drifted between memory and dream, reliving Red Hollow, the crack of branches, the dogs, the river swallowing Henry, until he woke to Eliza holding his hand firmly, anchoring him to the present, and he realized how far he had traveled not just in distance, but in time. By 1875, Josiah recovered, though he walked slower, yet his voice carried more weight than ever. Younger men seeking his counsel on whether to move, return south, or remain. He never claimed certainty, offering only perspective. Freedom does not promise ease. It promises choice. In 1877, news of the end of Reconstruction reached Buxton, federal troops withdrawn, and violence returning quietly, then loudly. Josiah listened in silence as reports of intimidation and broken promises crossed the border, feeling sorrow but not surprise, knowing history often advanced with hesitation and retreated when vigilance failed. That year, he gathered the children of Buxton beneath a wide oak and spoke plainly, telling them of the river, the moon, and the night men risked everything. He did not soften the truth, and when he finished, silence lingered until a child asked, "Would you do it again?" Josiah answered without pause, "Yes, every time." In 1879, Josiah began writing his story down, not all at once, and not in neat order, sometimes only a sentence, sometimes just a name. He feared forgetting details more than reliving them, his hand trembling as he recorded places that no longer existed as they once had. Edgefield District, Red Hollow, the unnamed river that had taken Henry. Writing, he discovered, was another kind of crossing. That same year, a group of white settlers arrived near Buxton, drawn by cheap land and rumors of opportunity, and tension followed them. Stares, whispers, the subtle reclaiming of authority. Josiah recognized the early language of control, knowing slavery did not always arrive with chains but sometimes disguised itself as law and custom. By 1881, his son was grown, taller than him, with hands shaped by work rather than fear, speaking of traveling west to build something new. Josiah felt pride and loss intertwine. He had run to survive, but his son wished to leave to expand, and that difference meant progress had roots. In 1883, Josiah visited Lake Erie again for the first time in decades, finding it unchanged, wide, indifferent, eternal. He stood quietly, remembering the crossing that had split his life in two, realizing the water had not freed him, his decision had, and the lake had only agreed to carry him. As winter approached in 1885, Josiah felt the weight of years settle fully. Gathering his family, he gave one final instruction, not a command, but a warning. Do not believe freedom is permanent. It must be protected, taught, and remembered. Outside, snow began to fall softly, covering the land he had claimed, not by force, but by endurance. In 1887, Josiah's hands began to fail him, arthritis stiffening his fingers and slowing the work that had once defined his days. Yet he adapted without complaint, shifting from labor to supervision, from action to guidance. He sat more often beneath the oak tree where children gathered, listening to their lessons and gently correcting dates, realizing that time was no longer something to outrun, but something to organize. That year, a young teacher arrived in Buxton, eager and sharp-minded, asking Josiah for stories of the early days. She wanted names, routes, details, and though Josiah hesitated, knowing memory carried responsibility, he agreed on one condition, that the story not center him alone, for escape was never singular, but stitched together by many hands, most unnamed and forgotten. By 1889, Josiah's son had gone west, sending letters from Manitoba describing open land and hard winters, and Josiah read them slowly, smiling at the unfamiliar place names, each letter proof that movement no longer meant danger, that running had transformed into choice, a distinction more important than distance. In 1891, Josiah fell ill again, this time without recovery, speaking little in his final days, conserving strength, and when he did speak, it was to remind Eliza where the written pages were kept, tied carefully in cloth. Let them read, he whispered. Let them know it wasn't easy, and that it was worth it. Josiah Carter died in the early spring of 1892, as the ground softened and apple trees budded again, buried facing east toward the land he had fled and the future he had helped reshape. Those who stood at his grave did not speak of him as a runaway, but as a founder, a witness, a man who crossed the night and taught others how to stand in daylight. In the years after Josiah's death, Buxton changed quietly, almost imperceptibly, as new generations grew up hearing his story not as legend but as instruction, and the oak tree where he once sat became a gathering place where elders spoke of rivers crossed in darkness and borders reached by faith rather than maps. And though the world beyond the settlement moved forward with machines, railways, and laws rewritten again and again, the people there understood that their freedom had been carried first on exhausted legs and steady resolve, and that remembering was not an act of nostalgia but a duty, because forgetting, they knew, was how chains learned to return in new forms. By the mid-1890s, Josiah's name was spoken less often aloud but carried quietly in habit and custom, in the way disputes were settled without violence, in the insistence that children learn dates as carefully as prayers, and in the belief that land was not truly owned unless it was protected for those who came next. When newcomers asked who had first shaped Buxton into such a place, the answer was rarely a single name, only a gesture toward the fields, the schoolhouse, and the long memory of endurance. As the century neared its end, the world beyond Buxton grew louder and faster, yet the settlement resisted haste, holding to the rhythm of seasons rather than headlines, and elders reminded the young that progress without memory was another form of erasure, that freedom once declared could still be undone if left unattended. Josiah's story was told again and again, not as tragedy, but as warning, not as heroism, but as responsibility. In 1901, a census taker passed through Buxton, noting farms, schools, and families who owned their homes outright, writing numbers and names without understanding the cost behind them. When asked how such stability had been achieved, An old woman answered simply that they had learned early the price of standing still and the necessity of standing together, a lesson passed down from those who had once crossed rivers under threat of death. Years later, children who had never known slavery played beneath the same oak tree where Josiah once sat, unaware that the shade above them had witnessed decisions that reshaped lives, and though they laughed freely, their parents made sure they understood that such ease was not accidental, but earned through fear, sacrifice, and nights when survival depended on silence, direction, and trust in others who refused to let them fall. And so Josiah Carter endured not in monuments or written law, but in continuity, in the simple fact that his descendants woke each morning unowned and unafraid, able to choose where to go and how to live. Though history recorded larger names and louder victories, the quiet truth remained that freedom often survived because ordinary men made extraordinary choices in the dark, crossed when the moon allowed, and taught those who followed how to remain standing once the running finally ended. History rarely remembers the ones who ran in silence, who crossed rivers without witnesses, who survived not to be famous but to make survival possible for those who followed. Josiah Carter did not change the world with speeches or armies, but with a single decision made in the dark, that life, even hunted and uncertain, was still worth claiming, and in that choice, repeated by thousands like him, freedom learned how to endure. If you had lived in that time, would you have risked everything to escape into the unknown, or stayed and survived another day? Tell us your answer in the comments.